The world is in turmoil. Civil wars are ongoing in many places. New wars start very often. Russia is still in standoff with Ukraine. What will the world become? Here is a possibility for the future. Russia, after the Ukrainian counteroffensives, attempt to reach the Dnieper River with the help of Belarus, who joins on the war on the side of their greatest ally. Although at first successful, Russia is eventually stopped and forced to dig into defensive positions. Behind the front lines, Russia commits several war crimes, including genocide in the newly opened and renewed gulags. This would severely weaken their international image, with Russia even being kicked out of the United Nations Security Council. Japan would replace Russia. Armenia and Kazakhstan are trying to also leave the CSTO and align themselves with the Western powers. Russian and Belarusian forces, following months of defending, attempt to push back the Ukrainians. This ends horribly, leading to Ukraine pushing out Russian forces and even starting to near Crimea. The nations of East Africa, still trying to create a constitution for the federation, launched the new common currency of the East African community. Other nations, such as Somalia and Mozambique, are also approaching the East African community. This is done to improve relations and, in Somalia's case, gain resources and weapons to help them with the civil war. Russian forces are kicked out of a 50-kilometer radius around Crimea, allowing for Ukraine to start its offensive in the peninsula. With support for the nation at an all-time high, NATO and the European Union will increase their relations with Ukraine in order to allow for the new nation to join both alliances. In Africa, Morocco occupies the remaining territories of Western Sahara with Western support, finally ending the conflict in the desert. Nations are starting to consolidate their relations with Taiwan as tensions between the Western-aligned Republic of China and Communist People's Republic of China skyrocket. Ukraine, following a shipment of brand new weapons, manages to besiege and capture the city of Sevastopol. With this, Russia is starting to consider a peace treaty, although it's very unlikely. Conflicts between Egypt and Ethiopia begin to escalate as each country starts supporting factions in Sudan. Both nations want to secure a puppet regime in the country. Ethiopia is also increasing diplomatic relations with the nations of East Africa in order to create an African defensive bloc. In Oceania, Bougainville gains its independence from Papua New Guinea, a small change to the world map. In Europe, Ukraine manages to push out the Russian forces entirely, with a peace treaty finally being signed, ending rebel actions in Donbass and returning Crimea to Ukraine. Following the Russian defeat, Armenia and Kazakhstan officially leave the CSTO, greatly weakening the Russian influence. In East Africa, Uganda, Kenya, Burundi, Rwanda, and Tanzania unite to form the East African Federation. Along with these nations, Mozambique is admitted into the East African community, which is transformed into a mix between economic and defensive alliance in the East African Pact. Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, the United States, and Indonesia all signed secret defensive pacts with Taiwan in order to try to protect the new nation. In response to this, China strengthens its ties with Laos, North Korea, and Cuba, while also starting to influence nations like Nicaragua, Angola, and Yemen. Scotland starts a campaign for independence in order to rejoin the European Union. Russia and Belarus unite to form the Union State in order to fix their economies, militaries, and policies. The Union State also starts promoting the CSTO in other countries. Ethiopia is admitted to the East African Pact in order to protect itself from Egypt. In retaliation, Egypt forms the Afro-Arab Defensive League with Libya, Algeria, Syria, and Iraq. Tensions in Cyprus rise as terrorist attacks from the ethnic Turkish population appear in Nicosia and other cities. This leads to Greece and Turkey attempting to solve the issue diplomatically in order to maintain peace in the NATO alliance. Japan, South Korea, and the Philippines sign a defensive treaty in Tokyo, creating the Pacific Treaty Organization. This alliance also agrees to guarantee the independence of Taiwan, creating great tensions in East Asia. Iran, following its alignment with the eastern powers of the Union State, and China starts developing nuclear bombs. This year, however, they finally start testing these nukes, with them declaring that the weapons will be perfected by 1936. This leads to Saudi Arabia to start greatly funding their own nuclear program, as tensions in the Persian Gulf are reaching at an all-time high. The Scottish independence campaign is reaching its heights, as the general public declares the need for a referendum. China starts consolidating its power by creating the Beijing Pact with Laos, North Korea, Pakistan, Iran, and Kyrgyzstan. The Kyrgyz government also declares they are resigning from the CSTO, as the Union state is only left with one ally, Tajikistan. The Ethiopian-led Afro-Arabian Defensive League expands with the admission of Lebanon and Eritrea to the alliance. The Third Sudanese Civil War becomes a proxy conflict between Ethiopia and the East African Pact, and Egypt with their Afro-Arab Defense League. Rebels in Darfur and Kordofan also rise up against the Sudanese government with the support from both parties. Darfur under Egypt and Kordofan under Ethiopia. Democratic forces are also supported by Ethiopia in order to try and create the Republic of Sudan. The goal of the Republic of Sudan would be to join the East African Pact. The East African Federation and the Democratic Republic of the Congo also send arms to the faction supported by Ethiopia. Scotland finally gains their independence following the referendum from last year. It ended with 53% of voters choosing complete independence from the United Kingdom, 34% choosing greater autonomy, and only 13% voting to remain. In the year of 2033, we would only be 10 years in the future. In Africa, South Sudan is admitted to the East African Federation as a new state within the federation. In Sudan, rebels in Darfur and Kordofan captured their respective regions, declaring independence as the new countries of the People's Republic of Darfur and the Republic of Kordofan. Along with this, democratic forces managed to besiege the city of Khartoum, greatly weakening the Ethiopian-supported government. Nations are starting to hit the Union state hard. Moldova and Georgia take over their rebellious areas of Transnistria and Abkhazia and South Ossetia respectively. Ethnic groups like the Chechens and the Tatars are also starting to protest in the streets, which leads to many imprisonments in those areas. Sudan is failing. Egypt, desperate to win out and solidify influence in East Africa, sends its aerial forces over Ethiopia. A bloody bombing campaign destroys the Renaissance Dam and many government buildings in Addis Ababa, including the embassies of other East African Pact members. This leads to a full-scale war between the Afro-Arab Defense League and the East African Pact. Ethiopia and the East African Federation start their own bombing campaigns over Cairo and Alexandria. The war leads to great tension in the Arab League, as Saudi Arabia, Morocco, the United Arab Emirates and Qatar all declare that Egypt has illegally destroyed the Ethiopian cities and accusing them of committing war crimes. By the end of the year, only Eritrea had mostly fallen, with Egypt setting its own puppet government in the west of the country. The Renaissance Dam crisis expands. Morocco, which has tensions with Algeria, joins the war on the side of the East African Pact, starting the Great March to Algiers. Egypt seizes the temporary Sudanese capital of Atbara, declaring the protectorate status over Sudan. This leads many to compare Egypt to fascist Italy, an incredibly motivated country that is, however, not truly prepared for their true ambitions. The Arab League declared that the Afro-Arab Defense League has committed several war crimes and unjustly annexed a fellow Arab country. This leads to all Afro-Arab Defense League members being kicked out of the Arab League. Morocco continues with their march to Algiers, capturing the western coastline of Algeria. In Asia, Indonesia and Malaysia are admitted into the Pacific Treaty Organization in order to protect themselves from the Chinese. Egypt launches a massive offense across the Nile River in an attempt to capture the city of Khartoum. This, however, ends horribly, with East African Pact forces advancing into Egyptian-occupied Sudanese territory and encircling the rebels in Darfur. Ethiopia captures all of Eritrea and prepares to launch an invasion across the Red Sea coast. Morocco continues the march on Algiers, reaching the outskirts of the city and forcing Algeria to sign a ceasefire. Libya also joins the ceasefire agreement, while Syria, Iraq and Lebanon declare neutrality. This leaves Egypt completely alone, with them still continuing the fight. Chechnya and Dagestan, following an all-out revolution, gain autonomy from the Union state. with important politicians from the area preparing for a full-on independence. Iran, following nuclear tests in the Zagros Mountains, declares their status as a nuclear power, with them already owning around 120 nukes. This leaves the Arab League with only one choice: extreme funding of the Saudi nuclear program. The East African Pact, following many years of war, entered the Egyptian territory. Ethiopia also begins their Great March on the Red Sea, capturing much of the Egyptian coast. This forces Egypt to surrender, with Darfur following soon after that. The final peace treaty is signed in Casablanca with the following terms. The Afro-Arab Defense League will be disbanded. African members of the Afro-Arab Defense League will have to pay war reparations. Kordofan will gain independence under a democratic government. Darfur and the remaining Sudanese lands will be united in order to form the Nubian Federation. The Nubian Federation will be admitted into the East African Pact. Ethiopia will annex Eritrea, Morocco will annex some bordering provinces of Algeria, and finally, Egypt and Algeria will be forced to demilitarize their armies. This ends the Renaissance Dam crisis, also known as the East African Great War. Special thanks to LosingContext, a member of my Discord, who provided me with the script for this amazing scenario. Link to his channel in the description. Tajikistan, the last ally of the Union State, declares neutrality and leaves the CSTO. This leads to the CSTO being disbanded as the Union State is being left alone. In Europe, Ukraine is admitted into NATO and the European Union, while Georgia, Montenegro, Albania, North Macedonia, and Bosnia join the European Union. The Turkic nations of Central Asia begin moving towards a federation, with an economic alliance being founded this year between the nations. The Syrian civil war reaches its climax as NATO and the Beijing Pact intervene in the war against ISIS. This leads to the civil war essentially becoming a proxy war between the USA and China. Serbia, in order to finally join the European Union, abandons past treaties with Russia and finally agrees to the independence of Kosovo, though the nation did have to abandon its Serbian minorities in order to gain international recognition. This leads to Serbia finally joining the European Union. Turkey, following many treaties with Greece and Cyprus, ends its occupation of northern Cyprus. Turkish president later declared in a speech in Istanbul, "Cypriot Turks are always welcome to Turkey. Terrorist attacks in northern Cyprus will lead to forceful deportation of the criminals to the Turkish prisons." This leads to Cypriot Turks moving to the country in massive numbers. Georgia and Armenia, following many years of improving their own countries and relations with the Western powers, are admitted into NATO, with Azerbaijan soon joining as well with Turkish support. Indian military spending is greatly increased as Chinese and Pakistani forces begin threatening Kashmir. The Union State continues to collapse. Democratic parties appear, especially in Belarus, while Chechnya and Dagestan finally break away. In order to maintain their current international image, the Union State simply lets these countries go. China keeps consolidating its power by inviting Afghanistan, Cambodia, Venezuela, Cuba, and Myanmar to the Beijing Pact. Out of these countries, only Venezuela and Myanmar join. The constitution of the Turkic Federation is signed, with Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, and Kyrgyzstan uniting to form the nation, which remains neutral in world politics. Somaliland is finally recognized by the majority of the world's nations, with this also ending the Somalian civil war. Syria finally finishes its civil war with the pro-Chinese government winning out. The collapse of the Union State continues. Tatar majority regions break away as the Republic of Tatarstan, while the Belarusian Independence Party gains majority support in its respective region. Saudi Arabia tests multiple nuclear bombs, with them soon being recognized as a nuclear power, with their 380 nukes, just 50 more than Iran. This leads to a nuclear race in the Middle East between the two powers. China intervenes in Yemen, finally ending the civil war, with the government coming out on top. Yemen later joins the Beijing Pact as a thank you. India is in grave danger, as surrounding nations are all trying to end the Indian nation. Mali ends its civil war by allowing the independence of Azawad, which now seeks relations with surrounding countries. Somalia and Malawi joined the East African Pact in an attempt to join the Federation. Northern Ireland holds a unification referendum with 74% of the population voting for unification with the Republic of Ireland. This also ends terrorist organizations such as the new IRA, bringing a period of internal peace for the United Kingdom. In 2048, the Union State will collapse. Belarus will finally gain their independence following a referendum, becoming its own republic. What is left is the Russian Federation, which now tries to avoid total collapse and also starts its democratization. In Canada, Quebec finally declares its independence, becoming the Republic of Quebec in late October. The Canadian mainland parts of Newfoundland and Labrador, having become much closer to the Quebecois majority, joined the new republic as well. Colombia starts a campaign for unification of the Andean countries in order to stand up to the Chinese and American imperialism, according to their president. Turkey, India, Bangladesh, Oman, Thailand, and Saudi Arabia signed the Treaty of Ankara, creating the Ankara Treaty Organization, an Asian defensive alliance set to destroy the Chinese ambitions for world domination. China assumes the protectorate status of Mongolia, invading and annexing the nation. The United Nations protest this move greatly, calling it the Second Anschluss. This leads to China being kicked out of the United Nations Security Council, being replaced with India. As a response to this, China starts claiming new territories and pushing around other countries for its own benefit. This scares many nations, such as Vietnam and Thailand, who joined the Pacific Treaty Organization. The war on drugs in Mexico is finally ended as support from the United States and NATO allows for the Mexican government to catch and imprison their greatest drug lords. This leaves Mexico in a period of rebuilding. Russia continues its collapse as Karelia breaks away, taking the Kola Peninsula with it. This leaves Russia in an extremely weak state, with China starting to influence the nation more and more every day. Romania and Moldova, following many years of separation, unite into a single country, finally uniting the Romanian people under one flag. Somalia and Mozambique are admitted into the East African Federation as new states of the Federation. China starts influencing the Caribbean with the help of Cuba in order to attempt an attack on the United States. Angola officially aligns itself with China in order to create its own sphere of influence in Africa. They want to bring themselves to a position of the greatest African nation. In response to this, Namibia and Zambia start seeking support from the East African Pact. Syria, Iraq, and Lebanon unite to form the United Arab Republic, a nation united under the pro-Chinese Syrian government. Democratization in Russia is stopped as internal tensions rise and create power vacuum in the former superpower. Kosovo and Albania unite to form the United Republic of Albania. Following Scottish independence, Catalonia also starts its own independence campaign. This year, however, a referendum was held with 97% voting for independence from Spain, which later followed. China starts influencing North Korea in an attempt to annex the nation. Chinese politicians claimed,
North Korea as a state was never meant to exist. An independent, united Korea also is a mistake. Korea has always belonged to China. The only problem is that South Korea is under American protection. That will change soon enough, at least.
The nations of West Africa begin planning a federation in the style of the East African Federation, with many francophone nations supporting the idea. Russia is starting to collapse internally. Many parties have risen to a status of possible leadership. Due to this, the leaders have begun considering the possibility of the Second Civil War. The leader of the Russia First Party has stated,
If Russia keeps heading down this path, there won't be one Russia, but 5 of them. There will be no Russia, just a remnant of what the former superpower was. This is why I want to reform this nation and recreate the former superpower status that Russia once had.
Due to this, many nations are preparing for the largest proxy conflict the world will ever see. Galicia and the Basque Country begin seeking independence from Spain. According to the leader of the Galician independence movement,
Spain as a state was meant to be, but not in its current form. Iberia should have 5 nations, not 3, not 2, not 1. This is the truth.
China annexes North Korea in a move declared unjust by the United Nations. South Korea attempts to activate the Pacific Treaty organizations, however, they are stopped due to its members not being prepared for an invasion of the country. In Africa, Egypt and Algeria attempt to recreate the Afro-Arab Defense League and get revenge on their enemies. In order to do this, they approach South Africa. The alliance, however, remains secret. China prepares for an invasion of Taiwan. The Pacific Treaty Organization has already started preparing for a defensive war in Taiwan and counterattack into mainland China. In Africa, Kordofan joins the Nubian Federation as an autonomous region due to the economic crisis ongoing a few years prior. Colombia and Ecuador unite, forming the Federation of Gran Colombia. The membership of Peru is now the main goal of the newly formed nation. Russia finally collapses. Nationalists, leftists and communists, Republican Democrats, authoritarians, and even the ethnic armies all begin fighting. The Second Russian Civil War has started, the Beijing Pact versus NATO, in one massive proxy war. By the end of the year, factions rivaling the Russian government had already made great progress, with many declaring the war would take at least a decade. Chinese volunteers are starting to help the Russian communists in the civil war. Shipment of armed forces is difficult, however, due to the location of the Russian communists in the Caucasus and Central Asia. NATO forces are also starting to help democratic forces located in the major cities. The nationalists and the totalitarians are left mostly alone, however, much of the former Russian army has joined the nationalists. In Africa, Mali, Guinea and Benin start promoting and funding the idea of the West African unified state. In Siberia, ethnic Yakut, Buryat and Chukchi people rise up against the Russian Federation. The Russian Liberation Front begins a campaign of connecting its two main spheres of influence, while the Russian Democratic Armed Forces sees all of Western Russia with NATO's support. Along with this, the nationalists begin consolidating their shared interest and sign a temporary armistice. Democratic forces in Western Russia push into the Caucasian region. Following this, they declare the Russian Federal Republic. In retaliation, China begins greatly funding the communist forces, who declare the Soviet Union of Russian people and push back the democratic armies. Nationalist forces manage to gain control over the Ural Mountains, starting a giant guerrilla war in all sides. A Chinese-supported communist revolution takes place in Vladivostok, with the revolutionaries capturing the Transnamur area and declaring the Siberian Soviet state. Let me summarize the Second Russian Civil War for you, as on the global stage, many nations support different Russian factions, such as Finland, France, the United States, UK, Brazil, Saudi Arabia and the East African Federation, who are funding the Democratic Front. China, Pakistan, Laos and South Africa, who are funding the Liberation Front. Iran, funding the nationalists and the totalitarians. Democratic forces sign an armistice with the nationalists, who have conquered all of Krasnoyarsk. The Liberation Front, following many bloody battles, solidified their position in the Caucasus and the Transnamur region. Japan sends armed forces to occupy Sakhalin and the Kuril Islands, which greatly angers the Chinese leader, who begins sending in armed forces from Mongolia. This indirectly leads to the Buryat people declaring a communist state. Democratic forces continue fighting against the Soviet Russians, but no progress is made. The totalitarians escape to Magadan, where they declare continuation of the Russian Federation and the Kremlin government. Russian nationalists will expand all the way to Krasnoyarsk, setting up two different republics due to the different ideologies. The Republic of Tanutuva, finally seeing their opportunity to declare independence, declare the Republic of Tuva. However, they are immediately invaded by the Chinese armed forces, who set up a communist government. China also starts influencing the Turkic Federation in case the Liberation Front cannot take over the entirety of Russia. In West Africa, Mali, Senegal, Guinea, Gambia, the Ivory Coast, Benin, Togo and Burkina Faso unite to form the West African Union. The Russian proxy war begins to end as multiple fronts are ending. with only the West still entering many bloody battles. In the end, the superpowers draw up and divide off the former Russian Empire during the Astana Conference, with them declaring to finalize the peace treaty next year. In 2063, the Russian divide finally takes place, as the Treaty of Volgograd is signed with the following terms. The West Russian Republic will be run by the Democratic Front, with its limits at Karelia, the Ural Mountains, Kuban and Volga rivers. The Union of Russian Soviet States will be run by the Liberation Front, with its limits in the north being defined by a 10-kilometer wide international demilitarized zone with the West Russian Republic. The People's Republic of Transnamur will be set up under the revolutionary government, with its limits being the former Russian provinces of Primorsky, Jewish Oblast, Amur and Khabarovsk. The Yakut, Chukchi, Buryat and Tuvan People's Republic will gain independence under their respective governments. The remaining Russian lands in the Far East will come under control of the Russian Federation and the former Kremlin government. Krasnoyarsk will come under the control of the nationalists as the nationalist state of Krasnoyarsk. Japan will annex Sakhalin and the Kuril Islands. Poland will annex Kaliningrad. Remaining lands between the Ural and Krasnoyarsk will be declared a neutral state known as the Republic of Uralia. Moscow will be occupied by the United States, China, Finland and the United Russian Soviet State. Russian nukes will be dismantled. Following this treaty, the United States and other NATO powers begin sending in reinforcements to the West Russian Republic, with China also sending in forces to South Russia, also known as Transkuban and Transnamur. Following this, the American president declares in his speech in Washington, D.C.
Armed forces are being sent in from both sides. Russia has been divided just like Germany was 120 years ago. A new Cold War has begun. This day, August 16th, is the start of a new era of war, rivalry and division. Prepare for anything. God bless America.
The Chinese leader responds to this by admitting the communist states created from the peace treaty into the Beijing Pact. This follows with West Russia coming under a special NATO protectorate status, while Krasnoyarsk, Yakutia, Chukchia and the Russian Federation, also known formally as Magadan, form a mutual defense pact declaring themselves as non-aligned to the two major factions. Venezuela, Paraguay and Peru leave the Rio Pact, claiming that American imperialism is over and that South America will rise again. NATO begin enforcing their position in Russia by supporting the Western Russian Republic, Yakutia and Chukchi militarily and economically, funding the industry of all of these nations. China also begins doing the same in order to solidify their own position in the collapsed Russia. Nicaragua, under Chinese and Cuban support, invades Costa Rica and Honduras. The war in Nicaragua begins to escalate as the United States begin funding the citizen militia, resisting the unjustly invaders. El Salvador also declares war on Nicaragua, claiming that Central America is meant to be united, but not under a Chinese vassal. American volunteers also begin moving through El Salvador in order to reach the capital of Honduras and defend the city. Israel begins militarizing its northern border with the United Arab Republic in order to prepare for a potential war. In Europe, France begins consolidating its position in the Mediterranean and forming many mutual defense pacts with nations like Greece, Spain, Italy, and Croatia. This is due to a concern over American stability and the idea of pan-European identity. In Central America, Nicaragua begins to be pushed back. Although reinforcements were sent in from both sides, Honduran and Costa Rican armed forces managed to regroup and form a massive counteroffensive against Nicaragua. Internal stability began to decline due to this, with many protesters appealing in the city of Managua. Even with all of this, Nicaragua still refused to surrender. Pakistan begins to face political instability. Although many Pakistani believe in the possibility of a greater Pakistan if their country remained allied with the Chinese, most of the population also fears an eventual communist dictatorship. The Central American War finally ends as Managua is captured and pro-Chinese government is overthrown. The Treaty of San Salvador is signed with the following terms. Honduras will be expanded to the Rio Tuma and surrounding mountains. Costa Rica will be expanded to Punta Gorda and Lake Nicaragua. Nicaragua will be occupied by American forces for 2 years. A democratic government will be established in Nicaragua. China launches a coup in the Turkic Federation. The coup is only mildly successful, leading to a civil war between the government and the communist rebels. The revolutionaries, located in the major cities in the republics of Kazakhstan and Turkmenistan, managed to capture most of the country by the end of the year, with only guerrilla forces remaining in the fight. The next year, the civil war in the Turkic Federation finalizes as the last guerrilla forces were defeated. This leads to the declaration of the Socialist Republic of Turkestan, a loyal Chinese ally and member of the Beijing Pact. This grand expansion of the Eastern powers leads to the United States and its allies promoting their military alliance to the world and starting their own campaigns of influence over certain nations. The Ankara Treaty Organization members hold an important conference in Mumbai, with 4 other nations of their status joining the alliance. These would be the countries of Israel, the United Arab Emirates, Ethiopia, and Morocco. Out of these countries, all but Ethiopia joined the Ankara Treaty Organization. Israel declared that their conflict with Muslim nation was over, including Palestine, as a peace treaty between the two nations was being worked on. As for Ethiopia, their president would later state,
"If Ethiopia joins the Third World War, it is only we or our true African allies are attacked. I am not sending my forces to the Himalayas for a nation I have no interest in. No, I am defending the Turks."
Nuclear developments are beginning to appear in some of the major nations due to fear of being invaded. This leads to a nuclear race due to both Western and Eastern allied nations beginning to develop nuclear weapons. Krasnoyarsk undergoes a military coup staged by the former members of the Wagner Group. The coup is successful, with the capital and later major cities coming under military control. The commanders later declare the creation of the Second Russian Empire, an ultra-nationalist, far-right state. The country, informally known as East Russia or still Krasnoyarsk, start preparing for a grand invasion of Siberia and later conquer the former Russian Empire. The superpowers respond to this by arming their respective aligned Russian states, with the USA sending arms to West Russia and China sending arms to Tuva, Buryatia and South Russia. Egypt begins falling to nationalist leaders as the general public demands revenge for the East African Great War. Surrounding countries, such as Algeria and Libya, also start seeking greater support for nationalist leaders. NATO holds a conference in Kyiv on the status of democratic European nation and their joining of NATO. Following the conference, West Russia and Belarus are admitted into NATO, with Karelia declaring neutrality. Serbia, seeing that allying with the East does nothing to help the nation, asked to join NATO and consolidate the European continent as a Western aligned haven. The process of admission for Serbia will take 1 year due to the past alignment with Putin's Russia. Krasnoyarsk began consolidating its power and influence. Their armies roll into Oralia, capturing the eastern half quickly, but soon being stomped by guerrilla forces and UN emergency armies protecting the neutral country. This forces Krasnoyarsk to sign a peace treaty, which would move the border to the Tas River in the north, slightly expanding the country. The United Nations declared their protectorate status of neutral countries in the Non-Alignment Policy Treaty, signed by most nations, though notable exclusions include China, their puppet states, Krasnoyarsk, and Egypt. Egypt, Algeria, and the United Arab Republic create a mutual defense pact under the name of the Cairo-Algiers-Baghdad Pact, also known as the Arab Axis. Israel and Palestine finally reach a peace settlement. The Treaty of Tel Aviv is signed by both nations, declaring that Jerusalem as a whole will be annexed by Israel, who would then recognize Palestine as a separate country. A new movement has started in some countries where neutral nations want to ally with themselves so that they can preserve peace. Its founding members are Karelia, Oralia, Yakutia, Tunisia, Switzerland, Austria, and Jordan. Other countries would seek to join this movement in order to protest the currently ongoing Second Cold War. The United Nations also declares their protection over any country that joins this movement. Tensions between China and Iran are beginning to rise. Differences between the two are already seen during the Second Russian Civil War, in which China supported the communists while Iran supported the nationalists. Due to this, the two nations have begun splitting in ideology, allies and more. China wanted to spread communism worldwide and create a world that submits to their leader, while Iran wanted glory to their own nation, something which they knew China didn't care about. Brazil finishes its nuclear developments as the final nuclear tests are finished. The arsenal of the country is estimated to be around 325 nukes, a very large amount for the country. In retaliation, Venezuela, Peru, and Paraguay signed a mutual defense pact, with the last two joining the Beijing Pact as well. Mozambique, unhappy with the internal status of the East African Federation, decides to declare independence, which follows soon after. Although their politicians want to maintain good relations with the East African Federation, they see the independence of Mozambique as better in many ways. The Sino-Iranian split continues as Iran begins allying themselves with nations like Egypt, the United Arab Republic, Algeria, Krasnoyarsk, and even Afghanistan, while China continues to grow its sphere of influence. In Africa, Angola finally starts expanding. Angolan forces move into Zambia and Namibia, capturing much of both nations' territories in just 3 months. This, however, turns into a proxy war as South Africa joins the war in order to annex as much of Namibia as possible, while the East African Federation and the Democratic Republic of the Congo sent arms to Zambia. China begins greatly preparing for an invasion of Taiwan. Although NATO and the Pacific Treaty Organization know that China is not capable of standing up to the armed forces of both alliances, they are still taking in the possibility of a Sino-Taiwanese war in the future. Angola and South Africa meet in Windhoek, agreeing to split Namibia and the QS and Nosip rivers. This allows Angola to refocus its forces on Zambia, which has a hard time holding back, though a surrender is far to come. The Sino-Iranian split finalizes, with Iran leaving the Beijing Pact, instead joining the Arab Axis, which is renamed to the League of Power. Angolan forces reach Lusaka, forcing the capitulation of Zambia. In the following Treaty of Luanda, Zambia would be fully annexed by Angola, while the situation in Namibia would be finalized. Following the treaty, Angola would declare the Zambesian Federation the new African superpower, at least according to them. The USA finally joins the Pacific Treaty Organization with Australia and New Zealand, in order to better protect the Pacific Ocean from Chinese influence. Venezuela, under Chinese support, invades Guinea in order to settle their border dispute. Suriname also joins, with many nations claiming that Iran encouraged them to do so. With a two-front war starting out of nowhere, Guinea has no chance, with Georgetown being captured very quickly by Venezuelan troops. In the Treaty of Paramaribo, the following terms were accepted. Venezuela and Suriname will annex their respective claimed lands. The remaining territories of Guinea will be administered by a neutral government. This government will refuse the United Nations aid in order to remain truly neutral and maintain a buffer between Venezuela and Suriname. Iran starts rallying countries around its ideas of creating a greater nation and standing up to the superpowers of the world. Along with this, during a meeting in Baghdad with the dictator of the United Arab Republic, the Iranian leader has stated,
"Before we allied with China, the United States was our greatest enemy. Now that I have seen the horrors of being a Chinese ally, though more so a vassal state, I declare China as our #1 enemy. I hope relations with the United States of America will improve, as we have a common enemy."
Zambezia keeps expanding by invading Zimbabwe. The very weak nation couldn't stand a chance, being rolled over easily. Zambezia soon annexed all of it, before starting a propaganda campaign in Mozambique in order to create a true union that Angola has always dreamed of. Egypt and Algeria jointly invade Libya in order to secure their lands. The weak country falls pretty easily, with Tripoli and Benghazi being captured by invading forces. In the Treaty of Alexandria, following the Libyan surrender, the country would be split, with Algeria annexing Tripolitania and Fezzan, while Egypt would annex Cyrenaica. This annexation, although protested by many nations, was seen as completely unjust by Iran, allied with Algeria and Egypt. Iran begins taking the role of leader in the League of Power, inviting its allies into the alliance. Following this, Krasnoyarsk, Afghanistan, and Magadan all joined the League of Power, something which greatly annoyed the Arab members of the alliance. China begins sending troops into Pakistan, preparing for an all-out invasion of India. Seeing this, the Ankara Treaty organizations begins to greatly arm India for the eventual invasion. Japan tests its first nuclear bombs in the island of Hokkaido. The United Nations declare that Japan now has around 75 nukes, turning them into a minor nuclear power, although one with great potential. Mozambique joins Zambezia, creating the union both countries have dreamed for so long. The League of Powers splits up, with Egypt, Algeria and the United Arab Republic leaving the alliance and joining the Beijing Pact. In response to this, Iran declares that they will destroy China, soon after requesting mutual defense pact with the United States of America, though no progress would be made towards it. China begins sending its troops all over the globe, to Egypt and Algeria, to Peru and Venezuela, to South Russia and Pakistan. This leads to NATO, the Pacific Treaty Organization, the Ankara Treaty Organization and the East African Pact to prepare for a Third World War. In the early hours of the 4th of February 2078, the Chinese forces would enter India through Pakistan. The Indian president would soon activate the Article 1 of the Ankara Treaty Organization, triggering the entire alliance into joining the war. China soon after that also called its allies. A war between the Ankara Treaty Organization and the Beijing Pact has started. Chinese forces managed to make a swift offensive through India, capturing much of its northern land. Himalayan forces also entered the country, violating the neutrality of Nepal and Bhutan by invading the nations. This leads to the United Nations calling all nations of the world, declaring that China is not a country worth saving. This leads to the Pacific Treaty Organization and NATO joining the war against China, opening up new fronts. South Korea and Japan begin moving into China, capturing Pyongyang before meeting Chinese forces. West Russia and South Russia begin fighting across the border, with the Western Russian Republic managing to push along the Black Sea coast. In South America, Brazil and Gran Colombia begin their offensives into Venezuela and Peru, while Argentina also starts an invasion of Paraguay. Cuba also takes control of Guantanamo Bay. In the Middle East, Iran and the League of Power also join the war, starting an invasion of the United Arab Republic. Turkey also joins the offensive, taking parts of the Syrian coast. In Africa, Egypt invades the Nubian Federation, bringing the East African Pact into the war. This also makes Morocco join the war, beginning their invasion into Algeria. India begins pushing back, as the Chinese army are forced out of most of the north, with only the Himalayas and Kashmir remaining under occupation. Following this, Indian forces begin a counter-offensive into Pakistan, threatening Islamabad and Pakistan as a whole. Afghanistan also joins the offensive, capturing Pashtun-majority regions of Pakistan. Saudi Arabia and Israel also begin invading the United Arab Republic, capturing Lebanon and southern Syria. This leads to great internal turmoil, which allows for Iran to capture Baghdad. This leads to the surrender of the United Arab Republic. Iran also begins an invasion into Turkestan, capturing Turkmenistan and sparking a rebellion inside of the country, with Kazakhstan breaking off as a federation of Turkestan. The combined forces managed to capture Uzbekistan, forcing the surrender of the pro-Chinese-led Turkestan. In Africa, Israeli, Ethiopian and Nubian forces begin to push back Egypt, capturing the Sinai Peninsula and much of the Red Sea coast. Morocco continues its offensive, nearly reaching the city of Algiers. In Europe, West Russia manages to break through the South Russian lines, pushing far past the regions of Kuban and even capturing the capital of the country. Along with this, Georgian and Armenian forces manage to push from the south, forcing the surrender of South Russia. China starts pushing back into Central Asia, while also greatly defending its captured territories. In South America, Venezuela begins to lose many territories, while Peru attempts to push into Gran Colombia. Paraguay also capitulates, following the Argentine capture of their capital. China pushes far into Central Asia, re-establishing their puppet state of the People's Republic of Uzbekistan. This forces the Ankara Treaty Organization members to move most of their forces into the region, weakening India, which is attempting to hold out. The country of Myanmar falls to a joint Thai and Bangladesh army forces invading the region. In Africa, Egypt continues losing much of their coastline, with Israel even passing the Suez Canal. Morocco manages to capture Algiers, however, this leads to great instability in Africa, as Azawad joins the war on the side of Algeria. This follows with the West African Union joining in on the war and starting an offensive into Azawad. In the Pacific, China finally launches an invasion of Taiwan, capturing much of the island. Chinese forces also begin pushing into Vietnam, however, guerrilla fighters hold back and manage to defeat most of the invading forces. This allows the Vietnamese army to start a counterattack through Laos and Cambodia, capturing much of both countries. Venezuela falls into riots that eventually turn into an all-out revolution against the dictatorial government. This allows Gran Colombia to focus on Peru, whose forces are being pushed out of the country. In North America, Cuba is invaded as the second Bay of Pigs invasion is started, with much of the island falling into American forces. China takes full control over Taiwan and begin pushing the Korean armies, even starting an offensive into South Korea, capturing Seoul. This leads to many American forces moving into Vietnam in order to prepare for an invasion of mainland China. India manages to capture much of the Chinese-held Pakistani land, even starting a small invasion into Tibet. Afghanistan also starts aiding India with the invasion. In the Americas, Cuba falls to the American invasion, while in the south, Peru begins to cripple as mass protests take place in Lima. China continues its offensive, helping Transnamur push into Magadan, even capturing the capital city of the country. In Central Asia, China begins taking a hold of the south, though Iranian forces are still holding out. Peru falls as a joint Colombian-Brazilian force takes Lima, ending the war in the Americas. In Africa, Azawad is pushed back on both sides, leading to their capitulation. This also allows much more pressure to be put into Egypt, who is attempting to hold out. Laos and Cambodia fall as their capitals are captured by the Vietnamese, Thai, and American forces. This shows crack in China's lines, which the Western powers would attempt to use to their advantage. In Central Asia, Turkestani forces begin pushing back the Chinese offensive. Iran, deciding that the war has not been going in their favor and seeing an opportunity to strike, declares war on Turkey, followed by their allies, and signs an armistice with China, bringing NATO into another war with Afghanistan. India, seeing this, begins pushing back Afghani forces, though not much progress is made. Turkey and Azerbaijan begin pushing into northern Iran, however, progress is slow due to the Zagros mountains. China uses the Iranian switch to their advantage, pushing back Indian forces and recapturing Kashmir. However, their luck runs out in Taiwan, with American and Japanese forces landing on the island. The East African Federation and Malawi begin an invasion into Zambezia. After capturing about half of Mozambique, this sparks a wave of nationalism in the area, with the rest of Mozambique rising up as the Republic of Mozambique. In Zambia, democratic and civilian forces also rise up, declaring a republic. This allows the East African Pact forces to push even further, capturing all of Zimbabwe as well. Egypt finally capitulates as Cairo and Alexandria are captured by Israeli forces. Korean and Japanese forces manage to break through Chinese lines, pushing up and crossing into Transnamur, where they capture the city of Vladivostok. This forces a movement of troops into the area, allowing Magadan to liberate itself. India, massively funded by the West, pushes Chinese forces out of the country and even manages to liberate Nepal. In Africa, the Democratic Republic of the Congo pushes back Zambesian forces, taking control over the oil resources of Cabinda and invading more of Angola. This allows troops from other parts of the East African Pact to capture Luanda, forcing the surrender of Angola. This allows the East African Pact to send its forces to other fronts, such as the one in Iran. Saudi Arabia decides to finish off Yemen, pushing into the unstable country and capturing its major cities in just 1 month, capitulating Yemen. China is starting to break, American forces liberate Taiwan, Vietnam is starting to push back, and South Korea is pushing into Manchuria. This has allowed certain rebel factions to gain power, with some of them even preparing to rebel. Iran is beginning to get pushed back by the Ankara Treaty Organization, with the Zagros Mountains largely coming under foreign occupation. Vietnamese and American soldiers start pushing into China, capturing parts of the southern coast. Korean and Japanese forces also manage to capture most of Manchuria. This finally ignites the rebel factions, with Mongolia, Xinjiang, and Tibet declaring democratic republics, while a pro-Taiwanese group rises in the south. This would greatly help the American war effort. Iran is starting to fall. Protests are taking place in the major cities, while India has pushed through Pakistan into eastern parts of the country. In Central Asia, the Chinese supported Uzbekistan switches sides, declaring their support for Turkestan. This allows all countries to focus on China and the Iranian coalition. China begins losing even more land as Inner Mongolia is captured by rebel troops, while Pacific Treaty Organization forces begin nearing Beijing. Krasnoyarsk begin to be pushed back by Turkestani and Turkish troops. China is almost broken. Beijing comes under siege, while in the south, the Chinese Republic has captured major cities such as Shanghai. Seeing this, the Chinese leader resigns, with only his political allies keeping the government together. Iran loses much of their coastline and decides to capitulate, hoping for a fair peace deal. This allows the forces of many countries to reach Krasnoyarsk, which loses many southern territories. The next year, Krasnoyarsk capitulates as the capital is captured by Turkestani troops. The Chinese puppets of Tuva and Buryatia revolt, declaring democratic republics. This, along with the capture of Beijing, leads to the surrender of China and bringing an end to the Third World War. Following the 9 years of bloodshed, the victorious countries meet up in Kyoto to discuss the peace treaties and their terms, which would come in effect the next year. The final peace treaties are finalized, these being the Treaty of Seoul, which would include Asia and former Russia. The United Russian Soviet State will be annexed into the Western Russian Republic, which would now be called the Russian Unitary Republic. Transnamur will be annexed by the Russian Federation, which would need to democratize over a period of 5 years. Krasnoyarsk will return its annexed lands to Uralia, while the country will need to democratize as well. Tuva and Buryatia will be run by newly established democratic governments. Afghanistan will be occupied by Indian, American, and Turkestani forces for 3 years, after which Afghanistan will democratize under Indian supervision. The Republic of Balochistan will gain independence, annexing Baloch minority lands from Pakistan and Iran. Azerbaijan will annex Azeri majority regions of Iran. The Republic of Kurdistan will gain independence, annexing Kurdish majority regions from the United Arab Republic and Iran. The United Arab Republic will be broken up into 3 countries: the Republic of Syria, the Republic of Lebanon, and the Republic of Mesopotamia, all of which will be run by democratic governments. The Republic of Turkestan will restore the former borders of the Turkic Federation under a democratic government. The Republic of Sindh will gain independence, annexing all lands of the former Pakistani province. India will annex its claims in Kashmir when the international community recognizes these boundaries. Laos, Cambodia, and Myanmar will need to democratize under Indian supervision. Yemen will be annexed and integrated into Saudi Arabia. The Treaty of Kyoto will include the lands of the People's Republic of China. Tibet will gain independence as a constitutional monarchy. Xinjiang will gain independence as the Republic of Urgistan. Hong Kong and Macau will be merged and expanded to form the Pearl River Republic. Mongolia will regain its independence as a republic and annex Inner Mongolia. South Korea will annex the Korean territories of China. Manchuria will gain independence under a Western-friendly Manchu government. The remaining territories of China will be rearranged into the Chinese Republic, a democratic country. Taiwan will be recognized as an independent nation, maintaining its right to reunify with the mainland. Beijing will be occupied by the United States, Japan, Korea, and India for 2 years. The Treaty of Sao Paulo will include all the lands in the Americas. Venezuela will lose bordering provinces to Gran Colombia and Brazil. Guyana will be re-established, taking back its lands from Venezuela. The remainder of Venezuela will come under a democratic government. Cuba will be annexed by the United States of America as an autonomous territory. Peru will lose its northern provinces to Gran Colombia, while the rest of the country will come under a democratic government. Paraguay will be annexed by Argentina as an autonomous region. The Treaty of Kinshasa would include all of the countries based in Africa. The Democratic Republic of the Congo will annex Cabinda from Zambezia. Zambezia will be broken up, with Zambia, Zimbabwe, Namibia and Mozambique regaining their independence. Israel will annex the Sinai Peninsula, integrating it as an autonomous region. Algeria will lose even more bordering provinces to Morocco. Libya will be re-established, even expanded through bordering territories from Egypt and Algeria. Egypt will lose some of their southern land to the Nubian Federation. Azawad will be annexed by the West African Union. Finally, the Treaty of Geneva will include all of the countries together. All countries involved in the war against NATO, the Pacific Treaty Organization, the Ankara Treaty Organization and the East African Pact, or the Rio Pact, will be forced to pay $600 trillion United States in war reparations. The nuclear weapons of said countries will be taken by the winners of the war. Any country that can prove its realignment with the Western powers has the right to reclaim its nukes, however, only the supervision of 3 other nuclear powers. The Beijing Pact and the League of Power will be dissolved, with similar alliances being forbidden. With the final peace treaty signed, the world would become a radically different place, with most international borders being completely altered. The Chinese Republic and Taiwan would hold a unification referendum, with the population of both countries largely voting towards it. Following this, the two countries would be reunited under one flag. With African unity at an all-time high following World War III, the East African Pact began receiving membership applications from other parts of Africa. In order to accept these countries, the East African Pact rebranded as the Dodoma Pact, an alliance for African nations. This would lead to Morocco and the West African Union joining the pact. Peru, following a political crisis, began moving towards unification with the Andean Federation. Patriotic sentiments worldwide lead to many different effects on the policies of many nations. These are largely seen in Arab countries, where a pan-Arab ideal is becoming even more popular, and in France, which wishes to reclaim its long-lost glory as a true superpower. Turkey and Azerbaijan are beginning to move towards the idea of joining Turkestan in order to finally unite the Turkic people. Kurds in Turkey are starting to move towards independence. In order to maintain peace in the Middle East, the Turkish president begins diplomatic efforts for the land transfer, signing treaties with the newly created Kurdistan. France begins moving towards the idea of pan-European alliance, which would refuse American intervention and create a powerful Europe. This idea has largely been promoted by more right-wing members of the French government, with many citizens supporting the idea. Uyghurstan signs the Treaty of Ashgabat with Turkestan, which states that they will be accepted as a new state of the country by 2093. Turkestan also began reforming to a much more federal government, renaming itself to the United Republic of Turkestan. French right-wing support begins greatly increasing as citizens begin supporting the new pan-European identity. This is especially seen in the elections, where 16% of the voters choosing a right-wing candidate. In Central America, the idea of a union has gone incredibly popular, largely supported by El Salvador, Honduras and Costa Rica. China regains their nukes after multiple treaties with the Big Five and other important United Nations members. It is also decided that Iran cannot be trusted with nukes, with their weapons being distributed between the nuclear powers. Uyghurstan is admitted into Turkestan, with Azerbaijan also applying for unification with the country. France continues their pan-European project by signing defensive treaties with Italy, Greece and Croatia. The French right-wing supporters also make up the plan to influence Italy, which has been showing signs of returning to Fratelli d'Italia recently, with 22% of the population voting for that party. These French ideals don't stop in Western Europe, however, as Poland begins dreaming about finally creating the Intermarium project. The United States of America is beginning to face internal turmoil as the general population begins opposing the two-party system, while even those content with the system are becoming incredibly opposed to their oppressing side. This was especially seen in the 2092 election, where representatives of the newly created Green Party, Syndicalist United America, Progressive Party and the American First Party ran all for president. Although the Democratic candidate won the election, it was only with 27% of the votes. This has led the United States government to prepare for including the multi-party system by 2096, while also revisiting other aspects of the government. Azerbaijan joins Turkestan as a new republic of the Federation, uniting most of the Turkic people. French far-right groups begin using the American internal weakness in propaganda, bringing even more support for the pan-European project. Uralia and Krasnoyarsk request to reunify with West Russia due to their increasingly worse economies. The process of unification is started this year, with a lot of progress already being made. The French right-wing elements begin preparing for the election in 2097, creating voting blocks in the south of the country. In 2096, the United States election takes place, with an incredibly tense atmosphere during the counting of the votes. In the end, the candidate of the America First Party ended up winning with just 23% of the votes. Due to him barely winning out, the representatives of other parties began demanding a recount, while citizens began protesting in the streets. The United States began preparing for a second civil war, with the army training especially hard due to inner divisions within their ranks. Krasnoyarsk and Uralia rejoin Russia, creating the power that Russia once had, just under a democratic government. Mozambique, Malawi, and Ethiopia joined the East African Federation as new states of the Federation. Ethiopia, although a powerful nation by itself, decided that it would be the best for its citizens to join the East African Federation. In 2097, the French election takes place. The voting blocks formally set up, having greatly expanded, managed to finalize their influence over the country, allowing the French Pan-European Alliance to win with 74% of the votes. The newly elected government immediately began continuing their alliance project, while also applying to resign from NATO and strengthen their relations with the Mediterranean countries. Internal alliances began appearing between the states in the United States, with Texas, Louisiana, and Florida creating the America First Bloc, the West Coast states creating the Progressive Bloc, and New England creating the Workers' Bloc, with Montana and surrounding states creating the Republican Bloc. This leads to many civilians preparing for another American Civil War. Poland begins following the French ideas, beginning to influence Slovakia, Czechia, Belarus, and Ukraine in order to form a Slavic bloc. France officially leaves NATO, with their president declaring,
"A new age for France, no, for Europe, has begun. No longer we will be in American hands. Our homeland will come out as victorious once and for all. Glory to France, glory to Europe."
This has led to other surrounding countries considering leaving NATO as well. The internal alliances of the United States begin preparing for succession, with the governor of Texas even stating,
"The United States of America was a great concept. However, in 1861 showed us that it can fail. This time we aren't fighting over slavery, we are fighting over our true rights. Texas will not remain neutral in this conflict. Our brothers in Louisiana, New Mexico, Florida, and Arkansas will not remain silent. Always America first."
Djibouti and Somaliland are accepted into the East African Federation as new states, finally uniting the Horn of Africa. The Italian elections take place, ending with a victory for Fratelli d'Italia. Following this, Italy leaves NATO, with Greece and Poland also resigning from the alliance. The United States of America collapses, just 1 year before the 2100 election. The Texan Bloc, New England, and the West Coast all declare independence, declaring the new countries of the United Republic of Texas and Louisiana, the Workers' Union of America, the Californian Republic, and the national state of Florida. Soon after, the Republicans declare their own Republic of the Midwest, while the Democrats gathered around the Republic of Virginia, and the Greens around Georgia. The Second American Civil War has officially started. By the end of the year, although not much progress is made, the central government in Washington DC collapsed, bringing a war between the rebels, all supported by different factions, though the Democrats are largely supported by most of the former US allies. France signs the Treaty of Ajaccio with Greece, Italy, and Croatia, creating the Mediterranean Security League. Due to the creation of this new alliance, many European states began leaving NATO due to both the American Civil War and the ideas of pan-European identity. By the end of the year, Germany, Belgium, Romania, Spain, Turkey, and the United Kingdom leave NATO. This leads to the alliance being disbanded due to the de facto leader, the United States of America, no longer existing as a nation. The two original parties of the United States of America also sign a truce, declaring that if the United States of America does not prevail, they will continue its legacy. In East Asia, China and Manchuria joined the Pacific Treaty Organization in order to protect themselves from the ever-shifting world order. With this, we have reached the end of the year 2100. Let me know if you want to live in such a world. Sadly, the world is in turmoil yet again, just like it was in the beginning of the video. In this timeline, France grew very strong, with the potential to unite all of Europe. In the video on the screen, I explored a scenario where Monaco annexes all of France in 1871. I suggest you give it a look.